Smoke, fire, silence. Two world wars, one generation apart, forever changed the course of human civilization. They weren't just battles of armies and ideologies, they were wars that redefined money, power, and the global economy. Because behind every tank, bullet, and flag, there was an invoice. War, after all, is the most expensive business on Earth. In 1914, Europe stood at the height of industrial progress. Factories roared, railways expanded, and global trade flourished. But when the First World War began, all that progress turned inward. From production for prosperity to production for destruction. Nations poured their entire economies into war. Britain borrowed billions. Germany printed money. The US became the banker of the world. Men went to the front lines, women to the factories. Economies became war machines, every citizen a cog in a global engine of survival. The cost? Over $200 billion, an unimaginable sum for that era. By 1918, Europe was not just bleeding from the battlefield, it was drowning in debt. Gold reserves were gone, currencies collapsed. In Germany, the mark became worthless. People carried baskets of cash just to buy bread. It wasn't just the end of a war, it was the end of an economic era. After World War I, the world tried to rebuild, but peace came with a price tag: reparations. Germany was forced to pay massive compensation to the Allies. To do that, it borrowed money, mostly from the US. The US lent billions, which flowed through Europe like blood through damaged veins. But when the American stock market crashed in 1929, the world's fragile recovery shattered. Factories closed, banks failed, unemployment soared. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a chain reaction caused by war debts, reparations, and overproduction. Global trade fell by 65%. People lost faith not just in governments, but in capitalism itself. In Germany, the desperation was unbearable, and in that despair, new voices rose. Voices that promised jobs, stability, and revenge. That promise gave birth to the Second World War. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, it became the largest economic mobilization in history. The US, Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union all turned into full-scale war economies. Factories once making cars now made tanks. Women filled every workforce. Science and industry fused together. Radar, jets, rockets, atomic energy, all born from necessity. Governments borrowed beyond imagination. The US alone spent over $300 billion on the war, nearly half of the world's total cost. But unlike after the World War I, the US didn't collapse, it thrived. Why? Because war turned it into the world's industrial giant. While Europe and Asia burned, American factories ran 24 hours a day. The dollar became the world's currency, and US exports rebuilt shattered nations. By 1945, the economic landscape of the planet had transformed. Europe was in ruins, cities flattened, industries gone. But America emerged stronger than ever. Its GDP had doubled. Its gold reserves held 2/3 of the world's supply. The Soviet Union also gained, industrializing rapidly through forced labor and state planning. But for Britain, France, and the old colonial powers, the war was the beginning of decline. They were broke. To rebuild, they sold assets, decolonized territories, and borrowed from the United States. For the first time in history, power shifted from Europe to America. And in that shift, a new global order was born.
In 1844, as the war raged on, 44 nations gathered in a quiet New Hampshire town called Bretton Woods, their mission to rebuild a shattered world economy. From that meeting came two institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and one rule. Every major currency would be tied to the US dollar, and the dollar would be tied to gold. This system made the US the banker of the post-war world. It funded Europe's recovery through the Marshall Plan, which poured billions into rebuilding factories, roads, and homes. Germany and Japan, once destroyed, were reborn as industrial powerhouses under American investment. War had burned everything, but from the ashes, capitalism rose stronger than before. But not everyone shared in this recovery. Colonies across Asia and Africa were drained during the wars, supplying troops, labor, and raw materials without fair compensation. India alone sent over 2.5 million soldiers and billions in resources. Yet after the war, these nations were left poor, starving, and heavily taxed. The economic injustice fueled independence movements from India to Kenya to Indonesia. Meanwhile, Europe's reconstruction came at a price. Dependency. Nations relied on US loans and imports, locking the global economy into an American-centered system. Even today, the echoes of that system remain. When the guns of World War II fell silent, a new kind of war began, the Cold War. This time, the battle wasn't for land, but for ideology. Capitalism versus communism. And once again, the economy became a weapon. The US poured billions into defense and technology, creating jobs, industries, and innovations like computers, satellites, and the internet. The Soviet Union responded with massive state spending, building factories, rockets, and nuclear arsenals. Both sides raced for power, but economically the US had the advantage. A free market, global trade dominance, and consumer spending that kept the economy alive. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it wasn't just a political defeat, it was an economic one. The West had outproduced, outtraded, and outspent its rival. Even today, the legacy of the world wars defines the modern economy. The concept of government spending during a crisis, Keynesian economics, was born in the Great Depression and perfected in wartime. The military-industrial complex, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, all emerged from those global conflicts. Modern globalization, the movement of goods, money, and labor across borders, began as a reconstruction strategy after 1945. Even the internet owes its birth to military research. But the wars also left deep scars, massive debts, environmental damage, and psychological trauma that no amount of rebuilding could erase. Every major financial institution today still operates within frameworks built to prevent another 1930s. Yet the irony is, the global system still runs on competition and conflict, just now through markets instead of missiles. The world wars proved one undeniable truth. War destroys, but it also transforms. From ashes rose the modern economy, powered by innovation, debt, and human resilience. But the question remains, do we need destruction to drive progress? Every new conflict, every economic crisis seems to follow the same pattern: collapse, rebuild, grow, repeat. Maybe humanity hasn't escaped the cycle. We've just changed its form. Because in the end, the story of war and economy is not just about nations. It's about us, our greed, our ambition, our endless chase for growth. And as history has shown, when money becomes the motive, peace becomes the price.